Hello, ladies and gentlemen. How are we doing? Welcome to our next computer side chat. Now, this is going to be fun for me because I just finished recording this video. It went really well. It was under the 15-minute mark that I like to keep these videos. But of course, this was the one time that I didn't do an audio check before recording this video, and for some reason my microphone decided not to work. So I recorded a nice, quick, thorough 13-minute video with no audio. So let's go ahead and do take two. Let's hope this time it actually works. So we're going to continue forward on our legislative branch unit today. To this point, you've looked at the structure of Congress, the two different branches, what the House does, what the Senate does, what the qualifications are to run for those two offices. Now we want to get into the powers of Congress. What can they do? What are the different types of powers that Congress has? And what areas do they focus on? So let's go ahead and get right into it. So first off, let's start with a little bit of a review, and let's talk about delegated powers. Now first off, what are delegated powers? These are powers given to the federal government, specifically Congress. In other words, these are powers that the federal government has, not the states. If you remember, there are two types of federal powers that we talked about back during our Constitution unit. The first are expressed or enumerated powers. These are powers that are specifically mentioned in the Constitution. So if you were to go into the Constitution, go to Article 1 where the legislative branch is talked about, you would find these powers written out in the Constitution itself. These are powers expressly written into the document. The next type of powers are implied powers, and these are powers that are not written in the Constitution but are necessary for Congress to carry out its job. And there are two things that we can thank for implied powers existing. The first is the necessary and proper clause, and this states that Congress may do whatever is necessary to carry out its job. The second thing is the Supreme Court case McCulloch versus Maryland. Now that we're getting into the three branches and we're going to talk very specifically about them, we're going to be talking about how Supreme Court cases have influenced the executive and legislative branches, and then when we get into the judicial branch, that's pretty much going to be all Supreme Court cases. So you should get used to the fact that when you see someone v. someone in italics, that's referring to a Supreme Court case. And the two names or groups mentioned are the two groups present at that trial. Anyways, so again, the second thing relevant to the creation of implied powers is the Supreme Court case McCulloch versus Maryland. And this established the interpretation of the necessary and proper clause that Congress has implied powers. The necessary and proper clause says that just because it's written in the Constitution doesn't mean that Congress can't do it. If it's relevant to their job of carrying out their express powers, then they can do that thing. So those are the two different types of powers laid out by the delegated powers in the Constitution. Or excuse me, the two different types of delegated powers, I should say. So let's go ahead and look at some examples of both of those. And let's start with express powers. The most important express power that Congress has is its commerce powers. And commerce powers basically state that Congress may regulate trade with foreign nations and between states. This is established by the Commerce Clause within the Constitution. So in other words, Congress can pass laws that deal with trade or the economy when it comes to nationally dealing with other countries worldwide, or when it deals with trade and economics between multiple states. So in other words, Congress can pass laws that deals with our trade or our industries here in Ohio that go from Ohio to other states such as Michigan or Indiana or Kentucky or wherever. Any industry that is strictly to Ohio, Congress can't necessarily pass laws that deal with that. They can specifically pass laws for industries that interact between multiple states. So that's what we mean when we say interstate commerce. this is probably the largest, most important, and wide-ranging power that Congress has, and it's the most important for you to understand. Now, this power has evolved a lot over time, and there are two major Supreme Court cases that we want to look at that deal with that expansion, or that changing interpretation of Congress's commerce powers. The first is Gibbons v. Ogden. This Supreme Court case said that Congress not only controls goods bought and sold between states, but they also control transportation. In other words, not only does Congress control regulations about goods going over state lines, but they also control transportations between multiple states. So things like railroads, things like buses that go from one state to another, things like air travel. These things are controlled by Congress and regulated by Congress, according to Gibbons v. Ogden. The other Supreme Court case that we care about is Heart of Atlanta Motel Incorporated v. U.S., and this ruled that Congress's commerce powers could be used to outlaw racial segregation and discrimination by businesses. So Congress can pass laws that outlaw discriminatory practices by businesses as part of their commerce powers. Next, let's move on to money powers. Now, these very simply are powers that Congress has that deals with money in some way. The first and most important money power that Congress has are taxes. And these are charges levied by the government to raise money to pay for government services. In other words, this is how government raises revenue so that it can pay for things. One big example of that is for things like tariffs, which are taxes on imported and exported goods. Another one was created by the 16th Amendment, which, if you remember back to our study of the 27 amendments, the 16th Amendment allowed Congress to tax people's income. In other words, Congress could levy income tax. So this is where Congress gets the majority of its revenue, is through taxes that it can levy using its money powers. The second type of money power that Congress has is the ability to borrow money. And this means that the U.S. may borrow from investors or other countries in order to pay for government services. So when we talk about the budget later on in this unit, when Congress decides what we're going to pay for and how much we're going to spend on it, for the last decade and a half, we've been running at a deficit. And what that means is what we've decided to pay for costs more than the amount of money that the government actually brings in. So we need to find another way to get that money so we can pay for all of these things. And so we borrow money from countries like China or from other investors so that we can pay the difference between the amount of money that we have and the amount of money that we want to spend. Government has to pay for a lot of things and a lot of services. We borrow money so that we can pay for things like Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, welfare, the military, and a ton of other things. Now, the downside of this is this leads to an increase in the public or national debt. And this is the amount of money borrowed that the government has yet to repay. Our current debt stands at a little over $20 trillion. And since we are still running at a deficit, that is still increasing. It will probably go up by another $10 trillion over the next 10 years, if not more. So dealing with that and figuring out a way to deal with our debt issue is a major, major issue that is talked about all the time in Congress and in the media. Lastly is Congress's ability to coin money. Congress may create and determine the value of currency. In other words, it's Congress's job to dictate that we print money, that we create coinage, and they in some ways dictate the value of that money. We'll get more into the value of money and what dictates that when we get to our economics unit in the fourth quarter. The last express power we're going to care about are foreign policy powers, and there are three foreign policy powers that we're going to look at. First is immigration. So Congress may regulate policies regarding immigration to the U.S. by outside persons. In other words, people that want to come to our country from other countries, Congress passes legislation that set the parameters for that process. So if you want to come here from another country, what steps do you have to go through to apply for that? If you want to come here temporarily for something like a job or to go to college here in the United States, how do you apply for a visa so you can have that temporary stay? If you want to apply for something like a green card for permanent stay, how do you go about that? All of those processes are set by the federal government through their foreign policy powers. Probably the biggest and most controversial foreign policy issue of the Trump presidency has been building the wall. The wall along the southern border of the United States between the U.S. and Mexico. Are we going to do that? If we do, who's going to pay for it? If we do end up building that wall, that would be an example of a foreign policy power used by Congress. Next is approval of treaties, and if you remember, treaties are agreements that we make with other nations. Congress, specifically the Senate, approves all treaties signed with foreign nations. And the last major foreign policy power we want to look at are war powers. War powers are, excuse me, war powers basically state that only Congress may declare war. So if we want to go to war with someone, Congress has to make that declaration. Now, how we can deploy troops has become a little bit murkier in the past few decades. This has been established through something called the War Powers Resolution, which says that the president may deploy U.S. forces if an attack has occurred without the permission of Congress. So in other words, if we've been attacked by another nation, the president does not have to ask for Congress's permission to deploy troops to defend the United States. Also, when we set the War Powers Resolutions after 9/11 for our wars in the Middle East and Afghanistan and Iraq, those were very broad. It basically gives the president unchecked power to deploy the military in any way that he wants in the Middle East. That's been another hot topic in Congress lately. Should that War Powers Resolution passed after 9/11 be rescinded, and so therefore if the president wants to deploy troops in the Middle East, there is a bit more scrutiny and there has to be some kind of permission given by Congress for that. The last express power worth mentioning is impeachment. And this basically is that Congress may call for a trial to determine if a federal official should be removed from office. This actually falls in line with an implied power that we're going to talk about here shortly, oversight and investigation. But in other words, Congress is in charge of removing federal officials in any of the three branches who have maybe misused their power, who are unfit for office. All right, let's get into implied powers now. Let's look at the powers that aren't expressly written in the Constitution. And let's start by going back to the commerce powers again. Like I said before, these are the most important and most wide-ranging powers that Congress has. The expansion of commerce powers by the Supreme Court has given Congress the ability to do many, many more things that they originally could not do. This includes things such as setting the federal minimum wage, regulating air travel, building interstate highways, regulating manufacture, and regulating food and drugs. That's just a short list of the many ways that Congress has implied powers to control the economy or regulate the economy. The last implied power that we care about that is very important is oversight and investigation. And this means that Congress may investigate issues that deal specifically with the lawmaking process or represent a misuse of government power. In other words, Congress may use its investigation and oversight powers to do research about legislation that they might want to pass, or to investigate and look into the doings or matters of federal officials to see if they have done anything wrong that might deem impeachment or punishment of some kind. So two different examples of this. The first was during the Watergate scandal. Congressional investigations unearthed a wealth of illegal activity committed by President Richard Nixon. That illegal activity would have very much led to the impeachment and removal of Nixon from office. However, Nixon resigned because he saw the writing on the wall. So he resigned before any impeachment took place. And then to look at the research part of oversight and investigation, in the late 1800s, Congress investigated railroad regulation to inform legislation that would be passed that dealt with that area. So in other words, Congress looked into regulation and laws that had already been passed on the railroads, looked at the business practices of major railroad companies, and that information kind of helped guide their decisions when it came to passing laws and regulations on the railroad industry back in the 1800s. So that brings us to the end of this set of flip notes. If you have any questions, please let me know when you come into class tomorrow. As always, we will be having a discussion about these notes to make sure everything made sense. Go ahead and go to Schoology now and take the quiz on this set of notes. Have a great rest of your night, and I will see you guys tomorrow.